The phone call lasted exactly 7 minutes. 7 minutes that would send shockwaves through diplomatic channels across 3 continents, destroy relationships that took decades to build, and leave world leaders so furious that they broke with all protocol to publicly condemn an American president in ways we have never seen before in modern history. What happened in those 7 minutes, and what Trump said that caused such an explosive reaction, reveals something deeply troubling about where global politics is heading right now. And trust me when I tell you, by the end of this video, you will understand why this moment might be remembered as the turning point that changed everything. Before we get into the details of what exactly was said and why it has caused this international firestorm, I need you to understand the context, because without it, you cannot fully grasp why world leaders reacted with such unprecedented fury. This was not a simple disagreement over trade policy or military spending. This was not the usual diplomatic tension that gets smoothed over with carefully worded statements and behind-the-scenes negotiations. What Trump said cut so deep, touched on such sensitive historical wounds, and displayed such a fundamental misunderstanding of international relationships that leaders who have spent their entire careers maintaining composure and diplomatic professionalism completely abandoned any pretense of politeness. Let me take you back to the beginning of this crisis, because the story actually starts weeks before the infamous statement that has now dominated international headlines. There had been growing tension in private communications between Washington and several allied capitals over a range of issues. European leaders had been increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as American disengagement from traditional alliance structures. Asian allies were concerned about mixed signals regarding regional security commitments. And behind closed doors, there was a building sense that something was fundamentally changing in how America viewed its role in the world. The specific incident that triggered the current explosion occurred during what was supposed to be a routine call with a major European leader. The conversation started normally enough, with both sides exchanging the standard diplomatic pleasantries. But then Trump made a comment that those who have seen the transcript describe as jaw-dropping. He allegedly compared the leader's country to a specific historical period that carries enormous emotional weight, made claims about that nation's current policies that were demonstrably untrue, and did so in a manner that multiple sources describe as deliberately provocative and insulting. Now, I cannot reveal the exact words used because that transcript has been classified at the highest levels. But what I can tell you is that multiple officials who have seen it have described their reaction as physical shock. One senior diplomat told reporters off the record that they had never seen anything like it in 30 years of government service. Another described it as the diplomatic equivalent of detonating a nuclear weapon in the middle of a peace conference. The reaction was immediate and unlike anything we have witnessed in modern diplomatic history. Within hours of the call ending, the European leader convened an emergency meeting with their cabinet. Within a day, statements began emerging from capitals around the world, and what made these statements so extraordinary was their directness. Diplomatic language is usually designed to obscure, to soften, to leave room for interpretation and reconciliation. These statements did none of that. The German chancellor's statement described Trump's comments as appalling, false, and beneath the dignity of the office he holds. This kind of language is almost unheard of in official government communications between allied nations. The French president went even further, stating that the comments revealed a fundamental ignorance of history and a dangerous disregard for the values that have maintained peace and prosperity since the Second World War. The British Prime Minister, usually careful to maintain the special relationship, released a statement expressing deep concern and disappointment, while notably refusing to endorse or defend any aspect of Trump's position. But the European reaction was just the beginning. What happened next showed how quickly a single moment of diplomatic miscalculation can cascade into a global crisis. Asian allies, watching the European response with growing alarm, began reassessing their own positions. Japanese officials released a carefully worded statement that, while not directly criticizing Trump, emphasized Japan's commitment to fact-based diplomacy and mutual respect among allies. South Korean leaders, facing their own complex relationship with Washington, opted for silence, but that silence itself spoke volumes. And here is where the situation took an even more dangerous turn. because America's adversaries immediately recognized the opportunity that had been handed to them. Within 48 hours of the initial statements from European leaders, Russian state media was running wall-to-wall coverage of the diplomatic rift. Chinese officials, usually careful about directly commenting on Western internal disputes, made pointed remarks about the instability and unreliability of American leadership. Iranian leaders called the incident proof that America could not be trusted to honor agreements or maintain relationships. Now, you might be wondering what exactly Trump said that was so inflammatory. While the exact quote remains classified, multiple sources have pieced together the general content. The comment apparently involved a comparison between the European nation's current immigration policies and the policies of a notorious historical regime, a comparison that is not only historically inaccurate, but touches on deep wounds that are still raw decades after the events in question. Trump allegedly suggested that the country was repeating historical mistakes and that this made them unreliable partners in addressing current global challenges. The factual problems with this comparison are numerous and significant. First, the policies in question are not actually comparable in any meaningful way. Second, the historical reference demonstrated either ignorance of or indifference to the actual history involved. Third, the characterization of current policies was based on inaccurate information that has been repeatedly debunked. And fourth, the suggestion that these policies affected alliance reliability ignored decades of demonstrated cooperation and mutual support. What makes this situation even more complex is the domestic political context in which it occurred. Trump has long used provocative statements about foreign countries and leaders to energize his political base. This strategy has proven effective in rallying support among voters who believe that America has been taken advantage of by allies and trading partners. But what works in domestic politics can be disastrous on the international stage, where words carry different weight and where historical sensitivities can make certain comparisons explosive. The European leader who received the call has their own political considerations. Their response to Trump's comments will be closely watched by their domestic audience, many of whom have grown increasingly skeptical of American reliability as an ally. Coming across as too accommodating could be politically damaging, while an overly aggressive response could harm economic and security relationships that remain crucial despite the current tensions. This balancing act helps explain why the public statements have been so carefully calibrated, strong enough to satisfy domestic audiences, but not so aggressive as to make reconciliation impossible. Let me now explain why this matters so much beyond the immediate diplomatic drama, because what we are witnessing is not just a single incident, but a potential paradigm shift in how global alliances function. Since the end of World War II, the international order has been built on a foundation of American leadership of a coalition of democracies. This order has had many flaws and many critics, but it has also provided a framework for resolving disputes, deterring aggression, and facilitating economic cooperation. What happens when that framework begins to crack? The economic implications alone are staggering. Trade relationships between America and its traditional allies are worth trillions of dollars annually. Investment flows depend on stable political relationships and predictable policy environments. When leaders publicly describe each other's statements as appalling and false, it creates uncertainty that affects everything from currency markets to corporate planning to consumer confidence. In the days following the initial statements, we saw measurable movements in European and American stock markets, with sectors particularly dependent on transatlantic trade experiencing notable volatility. But the security implications may be even more significant. NATO, the alliance that has been the cornerstone of Western security for over 70 years, depends on trust between members. That trust is not just about believing that allies will honor their treaty commitments in the event of conflict. It is also about believing that allies share fundamental values and that communications between leaders will be conducted in good faith. When that trust erodes, even if the formal alliance structure remains intact, the practical effectiveness of the alliance diminishes. Consider what this means in the context of current global threats. Russian aggression against Ukraine has demanded a coordinated Western response. Chinese expansion in the Indo-Pacific requires aligned strategies among democratic nations. Climate change, pandemic preparedness, and terrorism all demand international cooperation. How can this cooperation be maintained when the leaders responsible for it are publicly attacking each other's statements as false and appalling? Now, I need to tell you about something that has not been widely reported, but that sources close to several European governments have confirmed. In the days following Trump's comments, there were urgent consultations among European leaders about how to respond as a bloc. The European Union, which has often struggled to present a united foreign policy front, came together with unusual speed and unanimity. This suggests that the incident has, perhaps paradoxically, strengthened European cohesion even as it has damaged transatlantic relations. Some analysts are now suggesting that this could be a preview of a world in which European nations rely less on American leadership and take more responsibility for their own security and foreign policy. The European Union already has the economic weight of a superpower. What it has lacked is the political will to use that weight independently of American direction. If Trump's comments accelerate the development of that political will, the long-term consequences could be enormous. But here is what concerns me most, and I think by now you can see why this story is so much bigger than a single diplomatic incident. We are witnessing what may be a fundamental realignment of global power structures. For decades, the question of how long American hegemony would last has been mostly theoretical. Most analysts assumed that any transition would be gradual, managed, and relatively orderly. What the current crisis suggests is that the transition might instead be chaotic, driven by miscalculation and emotion rather than strategic planning. The historical parallels are sobering. Previous transitions of global power, from British hegemony to American leadership, for example, were often accompanied by major conflicts and economic disruptions. The hope had been that the current transition, whatever form it takes, might be different, that the presence of nuclear weapons and economic interdependence would force a more careful approach. But what if that hope is unfounded? What if leaders are simply not capable of managing such a transition peacefully? Trump's defenders argue that his confrontational approach is necessary to shake up a system that has grown complacent and that has often worked against American interests. They point to legitimate grievances about allied burden sharing, trade imbalances, and bureaucratic inertia in international institutions. And to be fair, these grievances are not invented. European NATO members have historically spent less on defense than their treaty commitments require. Trade relationships have not always been balanced. International institutions have sometimes been ineffective or biased. But critics respond that the cure Trump offers is worse than the disease. Even if there are legitimate issues to be addressed, addressing them through public insults and historically loaded comparisons is counterproductive. It hardens opposition, makes compromise politically difficult, and hands propaganda victories to adversaries. A skilled diplomat, they argue, would find ways to pressure allies while maintaining the relationships necessary for long-term cooperation. What comes next is uncertain, and I want to be honest with you about that uncertainty. Some observers believe that this incident will blow over, that behind-the-scenes negotiations will eventually produce some kind of face-saving resolution, and that the fundamental relationships will endure. They point to previous incidents that seemed catastrophic at the time, but were eventually managed. They note that the underlying interest connecting America to its allies, shared security concerns, economic integration, cultural ties, remain strong despite the current tensions. Others are less optimistic. They argue that each incident of this kind causes permanent damage, that trust once broken is not easily repaired, and that we are witnessing a cumulative deterioration that may eventually prove irreversible. They point to polling data showing declining favorability toward America and allied countries, to political movements in Europe and Asia that advocate for reduced dependence on American leadership, and to the practical steps that countries are already taking to hedge against American unreliability. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes, but even a moderate assessment suggests that we are in a period of unusual danger and uncertainty. The systems and relationships that have maintained global stability are under stress. The leaders responsible for managing that stress do not seem to fully understand the consequences of their actions. And the adversaries who benefit from Western division are actively working to exploit the current situation. I want to take a moment now to address something that I think is often missing from coverage of these kinds of incidents. We talk about what leaders say and do, but we do not always talk about why they make the choices they make. Trump's approach to foreign policy is not random or senseless. It reflects a coherent, if controversial, worldview that sees international relations as fundamentally zero-sum, that distrusts multilateral institutions, and that prioritizes short-term transactional gains over long-term relationship building. This worldview has a long history in American political thought, even if it has not often been expressed so bluntly from the presidency. It appeals to voters who feel that America has sacrificed its interest for abstract principles and ungrateful allies. It resonates with those who see global engagement as draining American resources and limiting American freedom of action, and it reflects a genuine, if debatable, analysis of how international power actually works. The leaders who have condemned Trump's comments so strongly also have reasons for their responses that go beyond mere offense. They need to demonstrate to their domestic audiences that they will stand up for their country's dignity and interests. They need to signal to other international actors that they remain reliable partners even if America is not. And some of them genuinely believe that the international order Trump is challenging, for all its flaws, has been beneficial for their countries and for the world. Understanding these motivations does not tell us who is right, but it does help explain why this conflict is so intense and why resolution is so difficult. Both sides are operating according to their own logic, responding to their own pressures, and pursuing what they genuinely believe to be their country's interests. That is what makes international politics so challenging, the absence of a neutral arbiter who can simply determine who is correct and impose a solution. As we near the end of this analysis, I want to bring your attention back to the immediate situation and what it might mean for the coming weeks and months. The European leaders who have spoken out are now waiting to see how Trump responds. Will he double down, as he often does when criticized? Will he moderate his position, perhaps through surrogates rather than personal statements? Or will he simply move on to other topics, leaving the underlying tensions unresolved? Each of these responses would have different implications. Doubling down would further damage relationships, but would play well with Trump's domestic base. Moderation would be unusual for Trump, but could provide an off-ramp for the current crisis. Moving on without resolution would leave the underlying problems to fester, potentially erupting again at an even more dangerous moment. Meanwhile, the European nations involved are making their own calculations. Economic decisions that were pending are being reconsidered. Security cooperation that was taken for granted is being reevaluated. Political leaders who were already skeptical of American reliability are feeling vindicated. And the publics in these countries, whose support is essential for maintaining the democratic alliances that have defined the post-war order, are being reminded daily of American unpredictability. The global financial markets are watching closely. Every statement, every response, every indication of either reconciliation or escalation affects billions of dollars in asset values. Investors hate uncertainty, and the current situation provides uncertainty in abundance. The practical effects are already visible in currency fluctuations, stock price movements, and changes in how analysts assess political risk. And beyond the immediate crisis, there are longer-term questions that this incident forces us to confront. What kind of international order do we want? What role should America play in that order? How can democratic nations cooperate effectively when their leaders fundamentally disagree about values and methods? These are not abstract academic questions. They are practical challenges that will shape the world our children inherit. I started this video by telling you about a 7-minute phone call that changed everything. I hope you now understand why that description is not hyperbole. In 7 minutes, decades of careful relationship building were damaged. In 7 minutes, adversaries were handed a propaganda victory they could not have achieved on their own. In 7 minutes, the foundational assumptions of the international order were called into question in ways that may take years to resolve. What happens next depends on choices that will be made in the coming days and weeks by leaders in Washington, in European capitals, and around the world. Those choices will be influenced by domestic politics, by personal pride, by strategic calculation, and by factors we cannot predict. The only thing we can say with certainty is that the world after this incident is different from the world before it. If you found this analysis valuable, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is not over. There will be developments in the coming days that you need to understand, and I will be here to break them down for you. Leave a comment telling me what you think will happen next, because I genuinely want to know your perspective on this crisis. The next few weeks will be critical. Decisions made now will shape international relations for years to come. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that in a democracy, an informed public is the ultimate check on leaders who might otherwise make decisions without accountability. This is exactly the kind of moment when paying attention matters most. Thank you for watching. This has been one of the most complex situations I have covered, and I hope I have helped you understand not just what happened, but why it matters and where it might lead. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and never stop asking questions about the forces that shape our world.